Oh, or we're live now. Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody to the second Google Hangout on Air for Floating Forests, the Zooniverse project trying to use citizen science to help us look at the global distribution and abundance of kelp around the world through time. Global around the world, a little redundant. I'm here today with Dan Reed. Dan is the PI of the Santa Barbara Coastal Long-Term Ecological Research Site, a fantastic organization that's been studying kelp forests around the Santa Barbara, California area for about 10 years. And so we were going to talk today a little bit about Dan, the work he's done in the past, what's going on at SBC at the LTER. One of the great things about having Dan here as the LTER PI is that floating forests actually got its start at the LTER. Kyle Cavanaugh, who's one of our co-PIs on this project, who was on the Hangout last week, was a graduate student at Santa Barbara when he started working on the Landsat data, and that was really the genesis of everything that you see here before you today. So first off, hi Dan, welcome to our Hangout.
All right, thanks Jared, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you. So I had a couple of questions for you just to get a conversation started. And of course, for anybody who is listening in to our conversation, you are welcome to post questions either on the Q&A app or on Twitter. And I'll actually post that link right now to Twitter so that people can take a look at it. So Dan, here we go, link. I was actually curious if you could start by telling us a bit about how you even started getting into kelp forest research in the first place.
Okay, so going back to the beginning was, as a kid growing up in Santa Barbara, I always found the kelp forest fascinating. When the surf was small, then going out snorkeling in the kelp bed was kind of the thing to do, and it was always fascinated me. And so when I went to college, I figured that would be kind of something cool to study, and it kind of just took off from there. So, you know, I took courses in college, ended up going to a really cool place in Central California called Moss Landing Marine Labs. I worked with a guy there, Mike Foster, who was a really great mentor and knew a ton about kelp forests, and he kind of introduced me to it. And from there, I went on to work with another sort of giant in the field, Jim Estes at UC Santa Cruz. And from there I came to UC Santa Barbara and worked with a guy named Mike Nuschel and Al Eveling, who Mike Nuschel was one of the first scientists to actually use scuba to dive in kelp forests. So I kind of have been fortunate to have worked with a lot of really influential people in my life who have known a lot about kelp forests.
Yeah, I'm really curious with the San Nic work you did. I know we've talked about this a little bit in the past, but maybe tell us a little bit about that project. It's definitely one of the longer ongoing kelp forest projects out there.
Yeah, so the idea was, this is the work I did when I worked at UC Santa Cruz with Jim Estes. Back in 1980, there was, or late 70s I should say, there was a lot of concern about the sea otter population in California and how it was not showing a lot of signs of growth, and there was concern that the present population was located between two fairly large oil tanker ports, Moss Landing and Morro Bay, and the concern that a single large oil spill could potentially wipe out the population. So Fish and Wildlife Service was responsible for endangered species such as the sea otter, was being pressured to do something about it, and there was a decision made to translocate a population of sea otters out to San Nicolas Island. And prior to that translocation, there was a lot of interest in setting up study sites all around San Nicolas Island to get data on the composition and dynamics of the kelp forest prior to the introduction of sea otters, so they could actually look to see the effects that sea otters were having on that forest, on the forest around the island once otters were moved out there. So I worked out there to establish those monitoring sites in 1980, and I worked out there for probably about 4 years or so, and those monitoring sites are still ongoing. So there's a tremendous record of time series of abundances of and sizes of kelp forests, algae, invertebrates, and fish from about 7 or 8 sites around San Nicolas Island.
Oh, since the 80s.
Back to 1980. So
yeah.
that was my project.
Have you seen, I mean, so you've been diving out there since then. Have you seen many changes out there? How have things been?
You know, it's been a while since I was last out. It's probably been 15 years or so since I've been back out there. So I haven't looked closely at those data, but I have been in, you know, I certainly stay in touch with Jim Estes and some of the people that are working with those data, and they are seeing some interesting patterns with sea urchins and lobster and stuff that that really show that otters, you know, the interactions that otters are having with certain species. The otter population out there has not grown like they anticipated, and so the whole translocation has ultimately been declared a failure by the federal government, which has all sorts of legal ramifications. But the fact of the matter is, I think there's a population of about, I don't know, somewhere 40, 50, 60, somewhere less than 100 otters that are out there and thriving. The population is just not growing tremendously, and so yeah, it is ecologically, it really is an interesting experiment that has a lot of social implications as well. And there's, you know, frankly, there's a lot of controversy over whether it was a good decision to move them out there or not. But ecologically, it is providing a lot of really interesting information.
Yeah, the data set there, I mean, a data all the way back to 1980, that's impressive. It's actually, now that I've played around with that data a little bit, it's a really interesting set. So did working on that kind of a large-scale, long-term kelp forest investigation, did that kind of kickstart you into thinking about something like where you are now with the LTER?
Right. So, you know, when I worked on it, it wasn't a large, long-term project, right? It just started. We started, right? But, you know, I got involved in some work out there where we were looking at sea urchins and the dynamics of kelp and the role that various, you know, disturbance and oceanographic conditions have in influencing behavior of sea urchins and how that factors into the dynamics of kelp. And that led me to interact with some people at UC Santa Barbara, namely Al Ebeling, who one of my former professors, and really got me excited about going back to graduate school. So the SANDIC project really did fuel my desire to continue on to a PhD, which then led to a lot of the work I did in the early part of my career.
Yeah. Huh. So one thing that we get questions a lot on floating forests on the talk board about people are really interested that we're looking at kelp and want to know why we're looking at it using satellite data. And we've kind of talked back and forth about, you know, how the greater spatial extent that we can see in satellite data. We've had a couple of people ask us about why, you know, how does this relate to, say, when they're out diving and they're looking at giant kelp underwater. How does, so maybe you could tell us a little bit about kind of the LTER and how, what its mission is and how it thinks about kelp and quantifying how much kelp is out there in Santa Barbara in the area.
Okay, yeah, maybe just a little background on kind of the rationale for why the National Science Foundation established a long-term ecological research program. And yeah, the idea is that there are many ecological processes that play out over space and time scales that are really difficult to examine with the typical 2 to 4 year NSF grant. And so they recognize that really to get at some of these longer term issues, particularly in the context of a changing climate and changing world, that they really need to establish a different kind of funding platform that would allow scientists to study phenomena over long term and to try and expand their research regionally to make better predictions about, you know, how the natural world is changing in response to both human and natural sorts of changes in the environment. So with that in mind, the NSF established the network in 1980, and we responded to a call from NSF to add to that network. It started with 6 sites. It's now at 25 sites and has grown to an international network as a response to the U.S. Initiative. But in the year 2000, we responded to a request for proposals from the National Science Foundation to add coastal sites into the LTR network. Prior to then, they were largely terrestrial sites. So we put in a proposal to study the Santa Barbara Channel with the idea that they're interested in ecosystems that are at the land-ocean margin, and we thought kelp forests would be a great system to include in that context because they really occur at the narrow interface of the land-ocean where they can be potentially influenced by both land and ocean processes. So, our project is really looking at how the interaction between land and ocean processes plays out over a long term spatial and temporal context that is able to take advantage of changes in ocean climate on scales of years to decades. So part of that, the LTR, what they try to do to get synthesis going among the sites, I mean, the LTR sites cover a wide range of biomes, from deserts to tropical forests, temperate forests, you know, agricultural fields, the coral reefs, you name it. There's a really wide range of biomes that are characterized by the sites in the LTR network. And the idea was that if all these sites kind of could focus their research on core ecological areas, there could be synergistic synthesis across common ecological principles across a wide range of biomes. And so one of the biomes in that set of 5 core has to do with a couple of them, but disturbance being one and primary production being another, and kelp forests are in diversity being a third, right? And so kelp forests really are a great addition to the network of sites because one, they're one of the most productive ecosystems in the world. They're also, in terms of the latitudes that they're found, they're one of the more diverse ecosystems in temperate latitudes. And 3 is they're greatly influenced by disturbance. And all those things kind of come together in our research to try and see how the dynamics of kelp forests play out in this sort of environmental landscape. And
so it's that kind of magic combination of productivity, disturbance, and just such sort of incredible diversity all in one place.
Right. And some of the other core areas have to do with some of the more geochemical kinds of aspects, things like nutrient cycling and organic matter accumulation and decomposition. Those are all things that also play into, how kelp forests function and stuff. And its role in terms of, say, the floating forest, the effort that you and Kyle had really marshaled, is that the whole Landsat what Landsat was able to do for us before Kyle really got going on the Landsat imagery, we were really limited to studying fixed plots at a number of sites, 20 sites or so in the Santa Barbara region. And we do a lot of comprehensive sampling. We do a lot of to look at both the structure of these forests and as well as ecological functions like decomposition, primary production, and the like. But it was really hard to regionalize, from that beyond where we actually had measurements. And what the Landsat was able to do was to help us look to see how these dynamics play out over a much larger regional and temporal scale. And the Santa Barbara LTR was really instrumental in helping Kyle get this going because he was able to calibrate the surface reflectance in the satellite imagery of kelp to actually diver measurements in our long-term study plot. So he's able to go from these reflectance signals in the satellite imagery to actual estimates of kelp biomass, say. And so it really, the LTR provided the ecological context for the development of this data set so that it's more than just pictures of kelp. It's actually, real ecological parameters that can be assigned to these satellite images. And so it would be hard to extract the information out of the satellite images without a lot of the ground truthing that was done in these long-term study plots.
So yeah, so I've done a little bit of the ground truthing and had a lot of fun with it. Wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that works. Like, how does the LTR actually create data that lets us ground truth? So actually, the great thing is we'll be able to take even some of the, hopefully some of the data from floating forests and throw that against information we have. How does the LTR create that that information to ground truth the Landsat measurements?
Well, we have these fixed plots where we go out every month at a couple different sites, three sites actually, and we actually estimate the standing biomass of kelp. And we do that by taking a variety of measurements of the amount of, kelp on near the bottom and the midwater and at the surface. And we then, by collecting plants and calibrating plants to those measurements, we're able to say how much biomass of kelp is in per square meter of reef on the bottom is in different portions of the water column. And by doing that every month now at these sites for 15 years, we've really been able to show what the dynamics of these patches of kelp do. The Landsat imagery is what's so great about it, and why it's so optimal for kelp is because kelp is so dynamic in terms of changing from month to month. And the Landsat images provide the frequency of sampling you need to capture that dynamics. Mm-hmm. And having that frequent diver estimates of sampling, which really aren't done with a lot of other programs. A lot of programs will go out and sample once a year or so. Our ability to sample so frequently provided, a really good conduit to do a lot of the ground truthing with the satellite imagery, because we could pair up a satellite image taken on a given day with diver estimates taken within 2 weeks of when the satellite image was taken. So that helped us to really do the ground truthing and calibrate the satellite imagery to real estimates of biomass.
Yeah, it's really impressive. It constantly kind of playing around with some of that data and starting to look at the correlation. It just blows me away how tight the fit is. But I guess kind of moving beyond just the Landsat data, what are some of the other, the LTR has this always blew me away, the LTR has a huge amount of different projects going on at any one time, even just within kelp forests. What are some of the things that are going on at the LTR now that you're really excited about?
Well, as I mentioned, it really is looking at how land and ocean processes interact in the coastal zone. So, we have people working up in the coastal watersheds that are looking at, fluxes of nutrients and organic matter and how that varies with different land use types, land cover types, the role that fire plays and rainfall plays in the transport of that material to the ocean. We have oceanographers that are working on ships in the channel, moored instrument arrays, autonomous vehicles that are collecting a lot of information on the transport and flux of phytoplankton and propagules, larvae, spores, and the like, and how they are transported and how that transport varies seasonally and spatially. And so some of the things that I find particularly really interesting are the extent to which kelp forests are really, in terms of the community, is really reliant on the surrounding waters. The trophic structure of a kelp forest is really has two main pathways. A pathway that's driven by benthic production of macrophytes, kelp included, that is a detrital pathway and feeds organisms that feed directly on kelp or on kelp detritus. And then there's a whole another side of the food web that really gains its energy from production in the water column, primarily phytoplankton. And these two pathways kind of come together and merge at higher trophic levels. And there's a lot of interaction between different components of those pathways. I think in reef systems in general, it's really interesting in that you get the primary competitors for space actually occupying different trophic levels, and that being sessile suspension feeders that get their nutrition from planktonic production versus macroalgae that get their nutrition from sunlight and nutrients. And so it's really important to understand it. And so kelp has this primary role, and in determining the relative abundance of how space competition plays out on the bottom, because kelp forms a surface canopy, it shades out the algae, it favors the sessile suspension feeders. So there's this interaction that goes on, and then it's really important to understand, well, where are the suspension feeders getting their food from, and does kelp play a role in the food in the water column? And so a lot of the work that we've been doing in recent years, I think the conventional wisdom has been that kelp is really been instrumental in providing food for suspension feeders as well, because particulates of kelp, break off and are ingested by suspension feeders, and there's evidence from isotope analysis that suggests that kelp plays a really important role at all these different trophic levels. And the work that we've been able to do that takes advantage of the spatial and temporal scale of our data has been able to sort out reefs with and without kelp, at times with kelp and without kelp, to really show that kelp probably, in our system anyways, does not play a primary role in the sessile suspension feeding pathway of the food web. Instead, it really is phytoplankton. And is that phytoplankton coming from production in the near shore or offshore? And what are the processes oceanographic processes that either promote or inhibit the transport of both nutrients and phytoplankton across shelf and along shore? So those are some things that are kind of coming out of our more recent research that I find actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, it really moves the story outside of just the forest alone, and kind of gives a much bigger picture instead of just the forest. You'd also mentioned something to me about the mitigation and restoration projects you've been doing, the SONGS project. We actually had a question the other day on our talk section asking about artificial reefs. Someone had noticed some reefs that looked like they were really regularly spaced, and was that normal? Was it not normal? What's going on with the SONGS project, or can you tell me a little bit about kelp forest restoration in Southern California?
Yeah, so the project that I've had the most experience with has been going on for about 20 years now. And the SONGS project, SONGS stands for San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, and it is a nuclear coastal power plant in Southern California in North San Diego County. And the power plant, relies on a once-through seawater cooling system to cool the nuclear reactors. And that seawater cooling system takes in a volume of water that's, I can't remember how many billion gallons a day, but it's a volume of water that's equivalent to about a square mile 14 feet deep each day. And that water gets entrained into the power plant, it's heated up, and then discharged back into the ocean through this elaborate diffuser system that's intended to dissipate the heat. And that diffuser system has been implicated for causing a turbidity plume that then drifts over the kelp forest located offshore of the power plant, and has been implicated for the loss of about 200 acres of that kelp forest, or about 70 hectares.
Yeah.
So the coastal utility company was required to mitigate the impact that the power plant was having on the nearby kelp forest. And the decision was made to mitigate that through the construction of an artificial reef that was located in the vicinity but outside the influence of the power plant. So I've been working with the local regulatory agency in California, or the regional regulatory agency, the California Coastal Commission, in helping to both design and evaluate the success of an artificial reef that's designed to compensate for the loss of about 70 hectares of kelp and associated community of algae, invertebrates, and fish. And so I think a lot of the information that we've been able to garner over how kelp populations recover from natural disturbances such as storms and episodic outbreaks of sea urchins and stuff has gone into the design of how to build an artificial reef that would largely be a reef that would not have to be sustained through human intervention. The idea is to build a reef, let it colonize naturally, and let it persist, without help from humans, right? And so, that's all kind of basic ecology. And so I think a lot of the knowledge that, the scientific community in general, not just our research, but that the community collectively has accumulated over the years, has gone into helping to design an artificial reef, which to my knowledge is one of the largest artificial reefs in the world. It is about 70 hectares at this point in time. And it's largely of quarried rock that covers, a large amount of reef on the bottom. And it's been a really interesting project to look at colonization studies in an experimental way over a realistic scale that you couldn't expect to do with, the small scale building block kinds of artificial reefs that are done. So
right. No, it's a real opportunity to actually do some large scale manipulative ecology that I think most of us only hope that we can do.
Right. No, it would be not that it's a very interesting project, and not necessarily the kind of project that basic research would fund.
Yeah. So do you think, I'm just curious, I haven't looked at any pictures yet that are in that area, but do you think that those reefs are looking very different than say, a natural kelp forest?
So the reef has to meet a bunch of different standards. Some of those standards are absolute standards that are fixed values that are based on the estimated losses that were measured in the kelp bed off the power plant. And other performance standards are what we call relative standards, where certain attributes of the reef just have to be similar to natural reefs in the region. So we have, time series data. We go out and we do a bunch of monitoring on the artificial reef and adjacent nearby natural reefs, and evaluate all different, variety of measures of the community of algae, invertebrates, and fish that attempt to characterize the abundance and diversity of organisms and the function of those organisms living on the reef. In a lot of ways, the artificial reef, has been very similar to the natural reefs. It is performing in ways that you would expect natural reefs to behave. Some of the absolute standards have not been met. And it's not because we believe it's not because the reef is not functioning naturally, it's because those standards are based on the size of the reef needed to produce so much kelp or so much fish biomass. And we think that the reef is just not, in some regards, not large enough to actually attain those standards. But I personally, my feeling is that the reef has been successful in many ways. And it's got a ways to go before it fulfills all its requirements, but it's been it's a really interesting reef, and it's providing a lot of compensation for the resources that have been lost due to the operation of the power plant.
Yeah, well, I'll be curious as we go through the data coming out of floating forest in the end, if we can actually go through and we may even be able to do this with some of the data we have already. Look and see if we can actually see the reef kind of pop up through time.
It totally pops up. I mean, it used to be you could go on Google Earth and you could see our, Google Earth is a little higher resolution than Landsat.
Oh yeah.
We've worked with the Landsat data on the reef as well as other things, and it's hard to miss 70 hectares of solid kelp canopy. So it's clear if you were to look at the Landsat record, for instance, there would have been virtually very little kelp in the area of the artificial reef, and now the last, the larger phase of the artificial reef was built in 2008, and since then there's been a pretty solid canopy of kelp on that 70 hectares.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, great. Well, it's about that time. So I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today, Dan, and thanks anybody tuning in, either now or much later. But again, for those of you who are interested in learning more about kelp or kelp forests, please come by, check out www.floatingforest.org and help us map kelp forests around the world. You can also check out our blog at blog.floatingforest.org. We'll be posting this video as well as other hangouts with other kelp forest researchers as we make them going through time. And Dan, I just wanted to thank you so much. And if you have any last bits of Kelpie wisdom to impart?
Other than I appreciate your effort to raise the awareness. I think it's a real important and interesting ecosystem, and you're doing a great job trying to increase the awareness of it. So
great, thanks. Well, and yeah, any of you out there who have been enjoying Floating Forest, definitely tell other people about it. We're starting to put together some teaching materials, which should hopefully come online soon, so you can begin to take it into your schools or the classroom. All right, thanks so much, and thanks again, Dan.
All right, thanks, Jarrett.
All right.